Nixon had promised to bring Americans together again, but the 1960s activism and media attention fueled gay liberation and women's liberation movements, while young Latinos, Asian Americans, and Indian people stressed their own claims, drawing their own lessons from the nationalist movement that formed in the wake of Malcolm X's death. Black Power. Soon, Brown Power, Yellow Power, and Red Power became the slogans of movements constituting distinctly as new communities of protest. While politics turned in a conservative direction, cultural diversity emerged as a major counter-theme. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael, who had helped turn SNCC into an all-black organization, began to advocate Black Power as a means for African Americans to take control of their own communities. Formed in Oakland, California, the Black Panthers demanded social justice and ran breakfast programs and offered medical and educational services, while adopting a paramilitary style with black leather jackets, shoes, black berets, and firearms. Infuriated local authorities, whom the Panthers called pigs, responded with repeated raids on Panther officers, jailing many leaders. Black Power nevertheless continued to grow. In Chicago, Reverend Jesse Jackson rallied African Americans to boycott the A&P supermarket chain until the firm hired 700 black workers. Cultural nationalism became the most enduring component of Black Power. At San Francisco State University, students, with the help of the Black Panthers, demanded the creation of a Black Studies department, shutting down the campus until their demands were met. Meanwhile, trendsetters put aside Western dress for African-style dashikis and hairdos and rejected their slave names, and black parents gave children African names. This deepening sense of racial pride and solidarity was summed up in the popular slogan, "Black as Beautiful." Betty Friedan's feminine mystique had sparked a formation of the National Organization for Women, NOW, and a campaign for equal rights. This work, Feminine Mystique, challenged the 1950s idea of the happy suburban housewife. By the time Nixon took office, a more militant women's liberation movement attracted young women who had been active in civil rights, SDS, and campus anti-war movements. Attacking patriarchy, the women's liberation movement mirrored black activists by insisting that sisterhood is powerful, and attracted media attention by disrupting the Miss America pageant and staging bra burnings. Insisting that the personal is political, feminists critiqued the American family, marriage, and the workplace, and established women's clinics, daycare, and rape crisis centers, and shelters for battered women. The women's liberation movement also had a significant educational impact. Between 1970 and 1975, as many as 150 women's studies programs had been established. The women's liberation movement remained, however, a bastion of white middle-class women. Although some African-American women were outraged at the posturing of Black Power leaders like Stokely Carmichael, who joked that the only position for women in SNCC is prone, the majority remained wary of white women's appeal to sisterhood. African-American women formed their own womanist movement to address their own distinct cultural and political concerns. From the 1950s, gay rights groups like the Society for Individual Rights emerged in New York's Greenwich Village, San Francisco's North Beach, and other centers of gay nightlife. But it was during the tumultuous late 1960s that gay and lesbian movements encouraged many men and women to proclaim, say it loud, gay is proud. On June 27, 1969, a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, a well-known gay bar in Greenwich Village, provoked an uprising of angry homosexuals and transsexuals that lasted the entire night. Gay men and women in New York City formed the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF, announcing themselves as a revolutionary homosexual group of men and women who reject society's attempts to impose sexual roles and definitions of our nature. Gay activism, tied in with civil rights and anti-war protests, led to changes in public opinion and policies. The San Francisco-based Council on Religion and Homosexuality established a network for clergy sympathetic to gay and lesbian parishioners. The founders of gay liberation encouraged not only legal changes and the establishment of supporting institutions, but self-pride. The Chicano movement burst onto the scene in 1965 when the United Farm Workers, UFW, migrant workers, struck against California grape growers. While strike leader Cesar Chavez emerged as a national hero, many young Mexican Americans spearheaded an urban-based movement based on identity politics that Chavez himself rejected. They adopted the slang term Chicano in preference to Mexican American to express a militant ethnic nationalism. In March 1968, a blowout or walkout sent nearly 15,000 Chicano students into the streets of East Los Angeles, demanding that schools teach the history, literature, art, and language of Mexican Americans. Meanwhile, college students organized to demand Chicano studies on their campuses. Artistically, teatro, comprising film and drama, grew creatively on Mexican and Anglo cultural forms to explore the political dimensions of Mexican American societies. Chicano muralists painted an estimated 1,500 murals on public buildings throughout their communities, from the exteriors of retail shops to freeway overpasses, even to large drainage pipes. Even music was politicized, as the rock group Los Lobos dedicated their first album to the United Farm Workers. The American Indian Movement, AIM, founded in 1968, led the drive for pan-Indian identity. Its members represented mainly urban Indian communities, and its leaders were young and militant. On November 20th, 1969, 89 Indians, identifying themselves as Indians of all tribes, claimed Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay under the terms of an 1868 Sioux Treaty that gave Indians rights to unused federal property on Indian land. They occupied the island for 19 months. In November 1972, AIM staged an event known as the Trail of Broken Treaties that culminated in a week-long occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. Another occupation at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota turned violent in 1973 when the FBI killed 2 protesters after a 10-week siege. A 1978 longest walk from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. called attention to Indians' loss of tribal lands, a trend partly reversed by court cases and legislation. Yet on reservation and in urban areas with heavy Indian concentrations, alcohol abuse and ill health remained serious problems. An Indian literary renaissance began with Vine Deloria's Custodied for Your Sins in 1969 and has continued to bring Indian culture to a wider audience and inspire young Indians to explore their heritage. In 1968, students at the University of California at Berkeley founded the Asian American Political Alliance, AAPA, one of the first pan-Asian political organizations bringing together Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino-American activists. In response, Asian American activists rallied behind the people of Vietnam and proclaimed racial solidarity with their Asian brothers and sisters. Berkeley students sponsored the Asian American Experience in America Yellow Power Conference, inviting their peers to learn about Asian American history and destiny and the need to express Asian American solidarity in a predominantly white society. Between 1968 and 1973, major universities across the country introduced courses on Asian American studies, and a few set up interdisciplinary departments. Meanwhile, artists, writers, documentary filmmakers, oral historians, and anthropologists worked to recover the Asian American past. Community activists, ranging from college students to neighborhood artists, worked in a variety of campaigns to heighten public awareness. Other campaigns reflected the growing diversity of the Asian population. Filipinos, the fastest-growing group, organized to protest the destructive role of U.S.-backed Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Ultimately, however, in blurring intergroup differences, the Asian American movement failed to reach the growing population of new immigrants, especially the numerous Southeast Asians fleeing their devastated homeland. Richard M. Nixon inherited an increasingly unpopular war and a nation racked by internal discord. He promised a vague, just, and honorable peace in Southeast Asia and the restoration of law and order at home. Yet once in office, Nixon puzzled both friends and foes with contradictory domestic policy. He made stunning moves towards détente with the People's Republic of China, but widened the Vietnam War. Nixon worked hard in the White House, centralizing authority and reigning defiantly as an imperial president until he brought himself down. Nixon deeply desired to restore order in American society. Drugs, crime, campus revolts, racial discord, draft resistance. On every hand we find old standards violated, old values discarded, so he said. Despite his hostility to Great Society liberalism, Nixon surprised conservatives. He supported new Social Security benefits and subsidized housing for the poor, and oversaw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Conservatives judged a proposed family assistance plan too generous, while liberals found it inadequate. Moreover, the plan was expensive. Bipartisan opposition ultimately killed the bill. Nixon also embraced a policy of fiscal liberalism, accepting deficit spending and abandoning the gold standard while trying to halt inflation with wage and price controls. Finally, Nixon's support of black capitalism, adjustments or quotas favoring minority contractors in construction projects, created an explosive precedent for set-aside programs later blamed on liberals. Yet his Supreme Court nominees were solid conservatives, and he continued a Southern strategy of resistance to civil rights. His most unifying achievement was the culmination of JFK's quest to beat the Soviets in space, as Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July 1969. Nixon promised to bring peace with honor, but let the war drag on for 4 years. Brilliant and ruthless, Henry Kissinger helped Nixon centralize foreign policy making in the White House. In public, Nixon followed a policy of Vietnamization. In private, Nixon mulled over the option of a knockout blow to the North Vietnamese. Hoping to cut off North Vietnamese infiltration of the South, in April 1970, Nixon authorized a secret invasion of Cambodia. When the invasion went public, protests erupted on college campuses, including Kent State, Ohio, where National Guardsmen killed 4 unarmed students. Days later, 2 students were killed and a dozen wounded by police in Jackson State, a black school in Mississippi. Congressional opposition forced Nixon to end the Cambodian incursion. In February 1971, Nixon directed the South Vietnamese army to invade Laos and cut supply lines. But the demoralized invading force suffered a quick and humiliating defeat. While ordering stepped-up bombing of the North, Nixon also sent Kissinger to Paris for secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese, which were undercut by South Vietnamese opposition to a preliminary deal. On Christmas Day, 1972, hoping for a better negotiating position, Nixon ordered one final wave of bomb attacks on North Vietnamese cities. The January 1973 ceasefire, under which U.S. troops were withdrawn in return for a release of prisoners of war, could have been signed in 1969 had Nixon been willing to admit the war was unwinnable. In April 1975, North Vietnamese troops took over Saigon, and the communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam soon united the small nation. It had cost the United States 58,000 lives and $150 billion. Meanwhile, a 1971 Army court-martial found Lieutenant William Kelly guilty of killing at least 22 civilians in the My Lai massacre, revealing the brutality of American policy and discrediting U.S. Army leadership further. Apart from Vietnam, Nixon's foreign policy defied the expectations of liberals and conservatives alike. He initiated a policy of détente that replaced U.S.-Soviet bipolarity with multilateral relations, cultivating relations with the People's Republic of China and relaxing tensions with the Soviet Union. Opponents of the Vietnam War accused Nixon of double-dealing, while conservatives howled at any compromise with communist governments. But Nixon persisted in his plans, and anticipating an end to the Cold War on American terms. Ping-pong diplomacy began when a United States table tennis team visited China. After Kissinger had sounded out the Chinese leadership in secret, Nixon made a state visit in February 1972. Leveraging the China opening, Nixon went to Moscow and signed a series of agreements on science and technology, including a joint space program. Nixon also completed negotiations of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, also later known as SALT I. Nixon's last major diplomatic foray proved far less effective. Following the 1973 Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War, Kissinger's Middle Eastern shuttle diplomacy failed to secure a lasting peace. Nixon continued the trend of covert Cold War operations, allowing the CIA to cut secret deals with leaders of the Philippines, Iran, Nicaragua, and South Africa, supporting repressive regimes in each state. More controversial was CIA involvement in the overthrow of Chile's socialist leader Salvador Allende and subsequent support for the repressive Pinochet regime. Congressional and press investigations of covert actions only undermined the CIA's reputation and America's superpower status. As the election of 1972 approached, Nixon tightened his White House inner circle that assisted him in withholding information from the public, discrediting critics, and engaging in assorted dirty tricks. After failing to prevent the publication of the Pentagon Papers, secret documents revealing government deception in Vietnam, Nixon directed the Department of Justice to prosecute leaker Daniel Ellsberg for conspiracy, espionage, and theft. A team of plumbers, led by Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist. Despite a huge campaign war chest and a well-organized committee to re-elect the president, Nixon ran a skillful negative campaign charging George McGovern, the liberal Democratic nominee, with supporting abortion, acid, and amnesty for those who had resisted the draft or deserted the armed forces. Voter turnout fell to an all-time low, and McGovern lost every state but Massachusetts. In the short run, they tallied a monumental success. Nixon had presented himself as the candidate of Middle Americans, the great silent majority, and won re-election by a landslide. At the grandest moment of his long and complex political career, Nixon audaciously approved a plan to wiretap the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which ultimately backfired and destroyed his presidency. On June 17, 1972, a team of men were arrested while planting bugging devices in the DNC headquarters at the Watergate complex. Although Nixon disclaimed any knowledge of the plan, two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, followed a trail of evidence back to the nation's highest office. As congressional committees began investigating, a former Nixon aide revealed the existence of secret tape recordings of conversations held in the Oval Office. After a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, refused to allow Nixon to claim executive privilege and withhold the tapes, the president ordered Cox fired. On June 24, 1974, the Supreme Court voted unanimously that Nixon had to release the tapes to a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. Although incomplete, the Watergate tapes proved damning. They revealed Nixon's foul-mouthed racism and anti-Semitism, his direct involvement in the break-in and cover-up, and his conniving efforts to harass private citizens through federal agencies. The news media enjoyed a field day with the revelations of Nixon's engagement in criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice. In July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee adopted 3 articles of impeachment, charging Nixon with obstructing justice, abusing the power of his office, and acting in contempt of Congress. Charges of executive criminality had clouded the Nixon administration since his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned in disgrace following a bribery and tax evasion scandal. Gerald Ford was confirmed to replace Agnew. Faced with certain impeachment and conviction, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, admitting no more than a few errors in judgment.